Hello and welcome to Track Changes. And hello, Murray Griffin.
Hello, Francisca Curran. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thanks, and pretty ready for the break. It's so close.
It is. It's looming. And we've had a pretty busy year on Track Changes. What have been some of your favourite moments, I guess, favourite episodes?
Well, actually, my favourite moment hasn't yet come out. So hopefully everyone's also looking forward to our net zero episode in a couple of maybe days. I'm looking forward to listening to that, probably while I'm on a plane.
In the works. It's in the works. Yep.
Yeah, it's in the works. But another highlight was actually our previous episode where we spoke to Rebecca Hubbard about the High Seas Treaty. Because of the theme of multilateralism and the importance of multilateralism and the process they've been on and about to continue with, which is also discussed about a different thing in this episode.
Yeah, multilateralism is something that both Allison and Mark talk about in today's episode about COP30. And certainly, as you point out, the High Seas Treaty is a big triumph for multilateralism too.
Absolutely.
In a different forum.
But Mark, before we jump into that, what about you? What have been some highlights from your year, besides getting a new co-host podcast, obviously?
Yes, which has been brilliant, Francisca. But I guess for me, there's been quite a few. President Jose Ramos Horta of Timor-Leste was one, and Ralph Regenvanu, Vanuatu's brilliant climate change minister. Our chat with him was another. But I also keep going back to some comments from particular episodes. So one comment that really has stayed with me, which was from Melissa Aronchik in the climate obstructionism episode, who said, we are all climate communicators now because we live in a world that demands that we put climate change at the center of everything. So, that really stayed with me, that comment. Another comment was from Lindsay Goulden, who was in our Climate Change Activists Who Left Fossil Firms episode. And she said, why is it that we have a setup where we depend on a few executives in a few very powerful corporations to be good people in order for the world to be okay? And I just thought that was a brilliantly phrased question. How did we get to that place? And finally, I really liked Christian Downey's comment in his episode in the episode we did with him about industry associations, where he said that solving climate change isn't a scientific or a technological problem anymore. It's a political problem. And I thought that was a really powerful comment and quite a hopeful one as well, because it implies we have the science and technology, which, I mean, you'd agree is pretty much true.
I would agree, yeah. And there's a sort of theme amongst those three comments that you've made that feels like kind of empowering people to talk about and contribute to the transition, maybe politically or maybe, through those, I don't know, Christmas conversations with with relatives or in our work. Like, it's for everyone, and it's time. It's been time for quite a while. That's really interesting set of comments, Murray.
Yeah, so we're sort of post technological problem. It's a storytelling problem. It's a political problem. Okay, well, for today's episode, we both wanted to know how the COP30 climate summit in Belem, Brazil, panned out and what it means for COP31. And luckily for us, we have two top climate journalists from the International Carbon Pulse news service here today to tell us all about it. Allison Gacad is the North America editor for Carbon Pulse, and Mark Tilley is the Carbon Pulse Asia Pacific editor. So let's get into it. I'll kick off with questions focused on what happened at COP30, and then Francisca will focus mainly on next year's COP31. Here we go. Hello, Allison. Hello, Mark. Welcome to Track Changes.
Great to be back.
Yeah, happy to be back, Marie.
Congratulations on surviving the intensity of COP30. If I can start off by asking you each what you think was the biggest achievement of COP30. And Allison, I might ask you to go first on this one.
Thanks, Mary, for the congrats. It's definitely, I'm sure Mark can relate it as a reporter. It's probably the most intense 2-week reporting period of our
Yes,
career on an annual basis. But
absolutely.
it's always a good opportunity to chase after ministers and officials that otherwise really wouldn't give you the time of day. So,
Yeah, it's an
um,
extraordinary experience.
yeah, I guess going back to your question in terms of accomplishments, it sounds a bit cliche, but I do think it is still a model of multilateralism. The fact that countries are showing up and willing to talk into the long hours, through the fire at the venue, through protests, listening and taking it all, and really just showing up and with commitment to the cause. Save the US, of course, but that's a
Yeah,
different story.
yes,
Um, the fact that everyone else showed up and really stood behind whatever their position was and came to the negotiations and conclusions that we did, which we'll get into in a little bit, I think is important. It's a tough time for climate globally, but I think that the fact that countries are still willing to send people and stand behind what they view as climate action is really important. So a little bit measured, but I do think it's good to see.
yep. Okay, and over to you, Mark. What's your thought on the biggest achievement of the COP?
I would agree with Allison, the multilateralism aspect of it in terms of countries sticking to their commitments and not following the US out the door of leaving the Paris Agreement is pretty significant, I guess you could say. I mean, yeah, you're definitely seeing sort of the emergence of countries filling that gap that's being left behind by the US with countries like China and Brazil, and in some cases Europe. But I think it's particularly important to highlight that multilateralism piece because the world is very much fractured into this sort of multipolar world that we're living through at the moment, where there is a lot of other venues and international events where things haven't worked out, and that countries haven't been able to come together to reach a deal on something. I think the latest example of that was the International Maritime Organization's talks on the global carbon shipping fee that was pushed back a couple of months ago. So I think the fact that they managed to strike a deal, as sort of incremental as it was, as people as commentators have said that it is, the fact that they put forward this motion, and I think especially in the final decision text that was put out, the language around keeping 1.5 degrees alive, continuing to push for efforts to try and keep global temperatures within 1.5 as much as possible is significant, particularly because there's a lot of scientific opinion and consent and almost consensus saying that we've reached that level already, and we're going to exceed that level, and then there'll be a need for them to sort of correct that overshoot. So the fact that the decision text is still sort of angling towards keeping 1.5 degrees alive, I think is significant.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, we've done glass half full. Let's go glass half empty. What was the biggest disappointment of the COP? And Mark, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, the language around fossil fuels is probably the big red flag, given that a lot of the talk around this COP was trying to rebuild momentum around the global stock take decision that was made at COP28 in Dubai, whereby countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. There were other goals in there as well, like tripling renewable energy capacity and doubling energy efficiency. But yeah, the fact that the language of the final decision that came out in Brazil only made reference to the COP28 text, that language of the global stocktake, without explicitly using the phrase fossil fuels. And in these UN decision texts, everything, language is crucial. Every word is very important. So yeah, the fact that they didn't explicitly name fossil fuels, given the obvious, it is the obvious culprit to so much of what is going wrong in the climate right now, that they couldn't reach that agreement it gives a lot of ammunition to the skeptics, I guess, and the critics of this UN multilateral process that you can't even reference the most obvious and the biggest cause to the problem that you're trying to solve in the decision text that you're making, right? So
yes,
I would probably say that was a big disappointment.
Yeah. Okay. Allison, your take.
Yeah, I would say in a similar vein to Mark, I don't think that there was enough of focus or discussion around emissions reductions, which is truly how you keep 1.5 alive. We're starting to get into removals territory, and I think that conversation is necessary, but there needs to be really forefront discussion of how to reduce emissions. And that's evident in countries' nationally determined climate targets, right? We've seen many countries submit those, whether on time, past the deadline, or we're still seeing countries that still haven't submitted those. And there really wasn't much discussion or emphasis by countries to bolster or to talk about how they plan to meet their NDCs, whether that be in negotiations or their own country pavilions. From my perspective, that just wasn't a focus among nations. So it's this COP, you kind of saw the climate discussion go in a few different angles in terms of finance and trade, and really not emissions reduction. So yeah, disappointing, I'd say, from that perspective of really that's what we need, as Mark said, especially in addressing fossil fuels, which are the chief contributor to our emissions.
Yes, and I mean, it is interesting that the price of keeping multilateralism alive is to not talk very much about emissions mitigation. That's slightly disturbing, I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a touchy subject, and I know that even, for example, the EU was really fighting to get their NDC out, and obviously, they're a group of many countries in Europe that are all agreeing on the same climate target. Some countries may have their own individual climate targets within the EU, but as a consortium, if you will, they were struggling to get their NDC out. And if they as a group are, it's hard to then, they weren't in a position to place pressure on other countries to put their NDCs or hold their own NDCs accountable. And that did play a role when it came to China. But yeah, I can get to that in a little bit.
Yeah, so we'll come to that. So Mark, back to you. We do have a commitment from Brazil to lead development on a fossil fuel roadmap. I must say, whenever I hear the word policy roadmap, a little piece of me dies because so many policy roadmaps are so terrible. But tell us what that work will involve and how it ties in with a separate meeting that's coming up in April, I think. And also, will bringing that roadmap to life be part of Chris Bowen's role as president of negotiations?
So yeah, to take a step back, President Lula at the beginning of the talks kind of helped set the agenda to an extent about sort of calling for the need for fossil fuel roadmaps and roadmaps to transition away from fossil fuels, as well as to halt deforestation. And that kind of set the tone for, the first few days. There was a lot of momentum that came from that language in terms of multiple sort of countries and sort of groups of countries launching initiatives to, set up roadmaps to establish phase outs of fossil fuels. So one of those came about through what was classified as what was called the Belem Declaration to Transition Away from Fossil Fuels, and that was led by Colombia and the Netherlands, and they had, I think, a total of 24 countries sign on to that declaration, Australia being one of them, just for our listeners. But then also, and then I think the EU as well pitched its own version of a fossil fuel roadmap on the sidelines of the talks. There was a hope that it was that momentum was gonna be able to find its way into the final cover decision, the Mutiara decision that it was called, in mentioning the fossil fuel roadmaps. It didn't make it into the final decision because no mention of fossil fuels explicitly did. And so, yeah, at the very final hours of the session, Brazil announced sort of very much at the last minute, COP President Correa de Lago, he said basically that we're going to launch our own fossil fuel and deforestation roadmaps as a separate piece, basically, so that, we don't have to go through this whole lengthy negotiation process of trying to get countries to agree to it. We'll just do it ourselves and go from there. What it actually is going to look like, it's early days. They've said that they're going to be consulting over the next 11 months, and then through a series of meetings and seminars and studies was what the Brazilian presidency said. So in order to create a document that is balanced and impartial. So yeah, it's going to be, I guess, a series of meetings, and that's going to occur over the next year before it will be taken to COP31 in Turkey next year. So yeah, it's obviously, I'd say it's sort of early days to kind of figure out what the substance of that is going to look like. And there was a bit of mixed reactions to the government's announcements, or Brazil's announcement to that, basically because some in civil society were basically saying, well, this seems like a consolation prize because the presidency wasn't able to find a way to actually agree to it in the mainline text and negotiations. Others said it was sort of a good way to kind of maintain momentum on the issue. China's we managed to get some great comments from Li Gao, who is China's peak representative at the COP this year, and he basically said, well, we have our own roadmap, which is exemplified by its 5-year plan that it puts out, and basically saying, we don't need a roadmap, we have our own.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed response. What Australia will do with those roadmaps when they take it forward to COP31. I actually got the chance to ask Australia's Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen, who is set to become president of the negotiations next year, how he would take that forward. And he did say, yeah, on the one hand, it was a bit early to say, but on the other hand, he said that there are existing streams that we've already that has been agreed to through this latest agreement. So one of those was what is called in the text a mitigation accelerator, and that accelerator is designed to basically speed up implementation across the sectors to keep 1.5 within reach by countries basically implementing their nationally determined contributions.
Yep.
So yeah, he said they're gonna see how they could basically combine the roadmaps and that accelerator and see what becomes of it. But at the same time, it's still very early days. The decision to go ahead with those roadmaps was only announced, a couple of weeks ago. So
yeah,
we'll see what comes of it.
We will.
But yeah, it was a bit of a mixed response in terms of of how it was received, I think.
Yeah, I remember listening to an episode of a podcast called Irrational Fear, which was an interview with Chris Bowen. And in that, he was actually claiming credit or partial credit for that wording, a phase down of fossil fuels at COP28. So, I mean, I guess it'll be interesting to see where he takes it.
I mean, I think for the Australian side, throughout the 2 weeks of COP30, the negotiating team was very, they were asked publicly a lot of times, are you pushing for these roadmaps, and what's your position on this? And they've been very adamant that they have been very supportive of the language of fossil fuel transition away from fossil fuels. Right back to that COP28 agreement in Dubai.
Yep.
So they've been adamant and supportive of the language. I guess the next step for Australia, as well as the rest of the world, is okay, well, if you're supportive of it, then how do you actually go about doing that?
Exactly.
That's the tricky bit.
That is the great challenge. Allison, in the lead up to COP, last time we spoke, one of the headline promises was going to be the launch of Tropical Forests Forever, the Tropical Forest Forever facility, known as the TFFF. Can you tell us how this played out at COP?
For sure. It was definitely Brazil's, I think, way to try and garner finance for forests, not just for its own forests, but also forests and other emergent economies that are at risk of deforestation. This kind of operated independent of the COP process, but you definitely saw at the climate summit they were using it as an opportunity to try and garner pledges and announce pledges. So yeah, they were moderately successful. They were able to raise about $9.5 billion. It's a healthy amount of money. It's still a shy way away from the 25 billion that they were hoping for from governments. And they're also looking for 100 billion from private investors, but that's in the long term. So no hard deadlines there. They could still chip away at that in the near future. But it's interesting to see the countries that did step up in terms of announcing pledges at COP. You saw pledges from big one from Norway, who pledged 3 billion. Indonesia for 1 billion.
Oh, really?
Netherlands. Yeah, so it was a mix of as you can hear, like global North and global South countries.
Yep.
So it was great to see again multilateralism in action. That combined desire to put funds towards preventing deforestation and actually paying countries to keep their forests standing, which is great. One country that I will highlight that made a donation is Germany, and they eventually coughed up €1 billion, but that was after a little bit of a diplomatic spat that they had with Brazil. The German chancellor Friedrich Merz flew to Belem with a group of diplomats and some German media, and then came back. And upon arriving back in Germany, he held a press conference where he said in German, Belem wasn't that great. I'm paraphrasing, but he did not have great things to say about Belem and Germany, and told the reporters present in the room that we're so happy to be back in Germany. Like, what a great country we live in. We did not enjoy our time in Belem, and obviously that didn't sit well.
Yeah, I can imagine. You think diplomacy 101, that's a bit of a fail, but yes.
Yeah. And it was funny. The German media kind of put up a strong front and said, those comments, they shouldn't strain our relationship. And Brazilian President Lula kind of poked fun at it, and Merz was eventually the subject of many memes circulating in Brazil.
Yes.
And ended up coughing up €1 billion to TFFF. So at the end of the day, they put their money where their mouth is, perhaps.
Yep. And did philanthropists kick into that as well? Because I always think, everybody's after philanthropy dollars now because governments have scaled back so much. I had this image of philanthropists hiding deep in the Amazonian jungle just to get away from all these people that were sort of chasing down their dollars. But did they actually come through it all for the TFFF? Or was it mainly
It's a good question.
businesses and governments?
Not that I've seen so far. I will say our Brazil-based reporter Ilana Cardial follows TFFF quite closely. So if there's anybody who's on that beat day-to-day, it's definitely her at Carbon Pulse. But on a kind of maybe on a related angle, where we did see philanthropy step up is actually, and this is taking us outside of Brazil, but in supporting certain U.S. delegates to attend COP. So obviously the U.S. not being part of the Paris Agreement, philanthropy dollars and philanthropic organizations stepped in to get those Americans to be able to attend COP and talk about climate action back home.
Yes, well, let's talk about that now, because the US wasn't at the COP, but even though it was out of sight, I'm guessing it wasn't out of mind. Do you have any thoughts on how the climate change denial stance of the US administration influenced the negotiations or influenced the positions taken by various negotiating parties?
Thankfully, from what we saw on the ground and chatting with folks, it didn't seem like much. It's hard to exert that influence when you're not at the table. It's different from the International Maritime Organization, as Mark pointed out, where the U.S. is actively still present and actively speaking and forming alliances with other countries who are also on board. But you definitely didn't see that U.S. influence at COP. The influence that you did see were from other levels of American government who were champions of climate action. So you saw mayors, state representatives, Governor Gavin Newsom of California, always a bit of a celebrity walking around COP. So
Absolutely.
they definitely had their own scene going on in terms of the Americans that did show up. They were there to really proudly champion the fact that they were continuing the climate fight back home.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, yes, I'm very glad that they were there. And as you say, Gavin Newsom, definitely a bit of a celebrity and always a blunt speaker. So I'm sure his comments were very welcome. Mark, back to you, because another key development at the COP was this acronym called BAM. Tell us about BAM and what it will do and what will be the next steps in making it a reality.
So the BAM stands for the Belem Action Mechanism, or the Belem Action Mechanism for Just Transition. And it basically was born out of the action agenda, which runs parallel to the mainline negotiations in the way that these talks work. But early in the first week of the negotiations, I think China and the G77 came out and supported this idea of the action mechanism to be implemented. And there was a lot of groundswell around by civil society and the like in support for it. So basically it got agreed to in the final text to develop an action mechanism, which I think was the language in the text that was used. So basically it's designed to be this a body within underneath the UNFCCC, so within in-house basically, that will pool resources and by which I mean expertise and knowledge and that sort of thing, and basically act as an advisory body. So if countries who want to figure out how to do a just transition well, they can go to this body and seek their expertise, and be given that sort of the capacity that they need to help sort of carry it out. There was I think there was some talk about whether this was going to be, there would be sort of a fund set up for it to actually work, to actually be able to run its work and be able to help sort of operationalize some of this transition. But I don't think that ended up being decided. It was just going to be this mechanism that was housed within it. And so it kind of operates similar to the authorities that were working in Germany and Spain, I think, to transition their coal workers away from as those power stations were being shut down. And I think it has a similar role as what Australia's Net Zero Economic Authority has, but on a global scale. So but what was really significant was as part of the language that they used in terms of establishing the BAM was language around indigenous groups, around the rights of workers, the rights for free, prior and informed consent as part of that, how that transition should be carried out. So it was welcomed really, and I think a lot of experts and stakeholders and civil society were really surprised really that the language around it's very it's the strong emphasis on inclusivity that was focused that came through in the text was really welcomed. And one of them was saying that it was considered as a major achievement of this COP, like one of the biggest headline major achievements of the COP for workers and communities. And there was a lot of celebration that it was focusing so heavily on social justice. So that was probably one of the big positives, I guess you could say, in that respect.
Allison, back to you. The US and China are traditional rivals in so many ways. Tell us a bit about how that all played out at COP30, even though the US was absent. And maybe, since you're based in Vancouver, if you wanted to talk about what's Canada's role at the COP, that would be good as well.
Yeah, happy to start off with the China front. So as you mentioned, the US wasn't at COP and isn't part of when drawing out of the Paris Agreement. So that honestly, it alleviates a lot of the pressure from China to show up in a certain regard. And it allowed China to show up in its own way and in its own narrative. And we really saw that at COP. I worked on a great feature with Mark and Chiao, our correspondent based in Taiwan, about what exactly it was that China was looking to gain from being at this COP and this year. And really, in the absence of the US, people were looking to see if China would step up in terms of climate leadership, and China didn't necessarily offer that. Instead, what they wanted to offer was all of the technology that they produce for the world. And you saw that right when you walked into the venue. They had this big shiny pavilion, lots of panda merch and stuffed animals getting given out to folks.
Yep.
And big screens that are 24/7 on loop showcasing their solar panels, wind electricity, and really their efforts to decarbonize on that front from in terms of new power generation that have been successful, even though they are still building out and relying on coal. Now, that was a little bit different from how they necessarily performed when it came to the negotiations and the key outcomes. As I said earlier, with the US being gone, China doesn't necessarily have pressure with regards to emissions reductions. And China is still a very significant, if not the biggest emitter globally. And it should be on the country to set ambitious targets to reduce its emissions, especially given that it has its manufacturing capacity to produce the technology needed to decarbonize energy. So then the next question became, with the U.S. absent, who's going to step in and put pressure on China? And people were thinking that it was the EU, but the EU, as I said earlier, was a little bit distracted with trying to get their own NDC across, their own issues of trade measures when it comes to trying to get across its carbon border adjustment mechanism to settle on the international stage. And so they didn't have much political leverage to really pressure China to step up its emissions reductions ambition. So really the role that China played was to try and get its technology to the forefront and try to figure out a way to get its technology to be more appetizing in a sense amid all of these trade measures that are put in place that really are blocking ways for China to be able to get its technology out into the world, whether that be tariffs on its EVs, whether that be trade measures such as CBAM. These are items or measures that China thinks are really stopping the country from supporting global decarbonization. So they were successful on that front. They were able to pencil in the final negotiations talks at the mid-year climate summits in Bonn that happen every year to talk about trade measures. There's going to be what they call a high-level dialogue on trade measures in 2028. So it is interesting with the U.S. out of the picture, the way that China's been able to steer the discussions and the support they've gotten from that as well, with Brazil being a major ally and Brazil holding the COP presidency this year. So when it comes to the U.S. and China, China's stepping up in its own way, and with no U.S. to push back or support, it's kind of has its own wings and it's ready to go.
Yep. Okay. So in fact, I think both of you talked when we spoke just before the COP about the importance of trade issues in these COPs. So it certainly sounds like, once again, that was the case at this one. And what about Canada?
Yeah, Canada's interesting in terms of, it shares a lot of similarities with Australia in terms of being a resource economy. But when it comes to climate, it's really done a bit of a 180 in its positioning. As Mark said, Australia signed the roadmap on fossil fuels, and Canada was very much not a signatory and silent on that front. It was a surprise to some, but to folks who've been watching Canadian climate policy since Prime Minister Mark Carney entered office, hasn't necessarily been a surprise. He was a huge champion of carbon markets and climate finance, and was at one point a UN special envoy on the matters. But since taking office in Canada, has really taken a pro-fossil fuel agenda. At COP, you wouldn't be able to tell. I did a story on how Canada's environment minister, who was on the ground and really championing Canada's story was focused on Canada's carbon markets and Canada's funding of international climate finance. But really back home in Canada, Prime Minister Carney was bolstering new LNG deals, and soon after the COP had signed an MOU to get a pipeline, a new oil pipeline built across the coast from Alberta to the coast of Canada. So we definitely had the fossil fuel brewing back home, but on the world stage tried to portray this image of still being in the climate fight without addressing the root cause of climate change of the fossil fuels that Canada is willingly continuing to produce. So it finds itself in an interesting position. Definitely silent on, or quieter, much quieter on the climate front compared to COPs past, where under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, the Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault made a big show at COP28 of an emissions cap on the oil and gas industry. And that's nowhere to be seen as of now. So
Right.
in terms of looking at Canada and Australia as resource economies, it's interesting to see how the two have kind of taken different paths when it comes to the climate diplomacy front.
I mean, you would have to say Mark Carney is somebody who understands these issues. So I guess in a way you think, well, what is it that causes somebody who is an advocate for climate action, understands the need for climate action? Why is he backtracked so much? What's driven that? Because I presume there's lessons in that for other countries as well.
Yeah, it's the golden question. We're all trying to figure
work it out.
He's definitely playing some kind of political chess right now.
Yes, indeed.
That we're all in the middle of observing. But one really big driving factor is keeping up provincial and federal relations in Canada. I think under the former Prime Minister, that was quite strained, especially when it came to Canada's chief oil and gas producing province, Alberta, and the federal government. And it's clear that Prime Minister Carney is really making an effort to reconcile and show significance to that province and its economy. So we'll see how that plays out, because at the end of the day, there is still a focus on, if they are going to produce fossil fuels, how do they do it in a way that's responsible and low emissions? But we're in the early days of talks of these projects, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out from a climate perspective.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thanks very much. And Francisca, over to you.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Mark. I'm also appreciating the complexity of climate negotiations and how representatives show up versus what happens back home and what they're doing, like the example of Germany you gave as well. But now I'd like to turn our attention forward to COP31. And Mark, as you briefly mentioned earlier, Australia has secured the President of Negotiations role for COP31, while Turkey has the actual COP presidency and will obviously host the negotiations. But what are your thoughts on the workability of this arrangement and what that's going to look like?
Yeah, so I mean, the outcome that we saw at COP30 in Brazil, in terms of the outcome of hosting next year, yeah, I mean, it's something that really it's untested. We've never had the roles of the presidency shared this way before, and I think a part of that sort of came down to basically neither side willing to give up their positions of wanting to host. As we reported during the COP a couple of weeks ago, alongside my colleague and our boss Mike Szabo, there was a bit of geopolitical skullduggery. I think you could say in some ways, in the sense that it came out that basically because Australia and Turkey were so entrenched, there was a real risk that, because under the rules, if you can't reach an agreement on hosting, the talks default to the UNFCCC headquarters, which is in Germany. And Germany, throughout the 2 weeks, was absolutely adamant that they were not going to host a COP. They didn't want to do it whatsoever. And so they apparently exerted a lot of pressure on Australia to to drop its hosting rights. Its bid to physically host the COP. So which is why we have this arrangement that we have where Turkey is going to be the physical host of the COP and is technically going to be the COP president, but then they will delegate Australia to be president of negotiations. And so it's going to be a bit of a mixed bag. Australia as president of negotiations will have control over the negotiating texts and will be responsible for drafting decisions and that sort of thing, but they won't have control over the action agenda, which, as we've seen, like the action agenda can greatly influence the direction and sort of the momentum and some of the more progressive parts of the negotiations themselves. So the fact that will be, Turkey will ultimately have control over that, although Minister Bowen did tell me that they will be able to, they've agreed to consult each other on that action agenda. And it's going to be really interesting to see how they can get the balance right, because in the agreement that they struck, they've said that if there is a disagreement then between the two, and that they will negotiate with each other to come to a resolution. And so it seems like there's going to be a lot of potential, I guess, political chicanery that will have to be sort of navigated through. But part of this whole process was, as Australia has explained, is that they wanted to ensure that multilateralism was maintained, and that the Pacific's interest was represented through next year's COP. And so as part of that agreement with the negotiations, they've secured a pre-COP event in the Pacific next year, whereby leaders of countries will be able to go there and pledge supports to the Pacific Resilience Facility, which is the Pacific-led fund basically for climate resilience. And they've made a point to sort of, Australia's made a point to make sure that the Pacific's voices will be given prominence throughout the negotiations next year. At the same time, from Turkey's part, they throughout the 2 weeks that they were vying for the bid at the talks themselves, there was a lot of reporting going on about how they wanted to represent sort of all vulnerable countries, not just one particular region. And so it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out. But it's gonna be really interesting to see how it unfolds in practice, because I think it was a deal drawn out of compromise, perhaps bitterly so, you could potentially say. But it hasn't been done before in this process, so we don't really have anything explicit to compare it to.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting, and I think that pre-COP in the Pacific, Australia will set that agenda in partnership with Pacific Island countries. And it's also interesting what you said about Turkey wanting to represent more broadly vulnerable nations. But I'm curious to know if you think there are any other ramifications for the Pacific Island countries in this new arrangement. Do you think it's a win, or are they missing out?
Well, I think there's just from a logistical standpoint, having the COP in Australia, in the region of the Pacific, in Australia's case, they wanted to have it in Adelaide. It's just easier and cheaper to travel to. You're not going to have to a lot of delegations. It gets very expensive very quickly to fly across the world to attend these summits, and so just from a logistical standpoint, you could argue that the Pacific countries will be at a disadvantage just because they just have so much further to travel. And I mean, aside from that, I mean, I think there's some assuredness there that Australia is still very much part of the process in terms of being president of negotiations. I think from the Pacific countries representatives that we spoke to over the 2 weeks, like they were very much fully behind Australia's efforts. So I think the fact that Australia is going to be in front and center in that respect will give them some confidence that they will be adequately representative. But at the same time, there is some losses in other aspects. I mean, so obviously a big part of Australia hosting hosting it in Adelaide was that Indigenous Australians, First Nations Australians, were going to be have a greater voice and a greater say and be sort of more have a wider representation at the COP and in terms of the negotiations. But now, because it's not in that physical location anymore, they won't have their presence felt as much. So that is one drawback from an Australian perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but obviously, but on the Pacific part, there is still a lot of positivity. Thanks to how sort of Australia has managed to navigate this
and to set up that arrangement. Yeah, even though we have, obviously we've lost out on having it in Adelaide. And I know there was a lot of suspense in the lead up and a lot of talk and a lot of organisations in Australia preparing what they would do if we got COP presidency and we were hosting. I guess taking a step back, has this somewhat painful process of deciding the COP31 hosting arrangements, has it strengthened calls for a broader rethink of COP processes, or are there any changes we might expect in the future?
I don't think so. I mean, I think there's been some commentary that I've read where this arrangement could actually be seen in a more sort of positive light, in the sense that if you have countries that don't necessarily have the logistical capability or capacity to host an event like COP, that they could be placed in a similar role as president of negotiations and really sort of drive the agenda that way. So there could be sort of some avenues, some new avenues for broader, sort of more multilateral participation. That's, I guess, a half glass full perspective. Another more negative perspective I've heard is basically, you could argue that this whole process has demonstrated that if one country just, digs in and refuses to yield and sort of basically just refuses to budge on yielding what it wants, then it will be rewarded for it. So yeah, you could draw both diverging conclusions depending on your outlook on how this has unfolded.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, there's a lot of players involved, and under the COP arrangements, Brazil still technically holds the presidency until the start of COP31, until the start of the summit, and then Turkiye takes it from there. And I think Ethiopia, as the host of COP32, also has a role in the lead up to COP31. And I'm curious to know the mix of these countries involved and Australia as well. Are there any positives or negatives that you see specifically with this mix?
Well, yeah, I think that was part of the sort of the narrative, in the sense of the Africa group of nations being able to select Ethiopia as their host for COP32. They sort of were organized enough to be able to nominate and elect a host, before the Western European and others group had elected Australia or Turkiye, or turned into the arrangement that it had. But I think in terms of the common threads, potentially, I think there was a big hope that because there was such a large Indigenous representation in Brazil at COP30, that thread could be sort of carried over into COP31 in Adelaide with Indigenous Australians in the Pacific. But obviously, I think Australia getting presidency in negotiations will potentially be able to carry that terrain forward into COP31. And then, it could be potentially, carried further again into COP32.
I think, Allison, earlier you mentioned, protests amongst the other things at COP30 that you had to get through the fire. But I'm curious about the protests, what the kind of narrative around them was and what you think we could expect in the future or where it's heading.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it happened quite early in the conference. And I guess what was different about the protests that took place at this COP versus past COPs is that they were taking place outside of the venue. And Brazil's it's a democratic country. People have the right to protest, and that wasn't necessarily the case in countries where COPs have taken place in past years. And as a result, you saw a lot of civil society really show up in the early days of the conference, and one of the early days ended up storming into the venue, blowing past security, and really just forcing their way in. It was a group of Indigenous protesters who, from what I understood, were upset that they were Indigenous to the Amazon, to Brazil, and they didn't have a seat at the table in these negotiations and in these discussions of the climate futures. And understandably, the reaction from that was quite strong. You saw a lot of solidarity from civil society groups that made calls for the fact that, why don't these folks have a seat at the table, and why do we see so much industry at COP? On the other hand, the kind of logistic reaction that took place from the UN was that it became an incredibly heavily militarized conference. From my perspective, this is the third COP that I've attended in a row. This is probably the most military that I've seen around a COP, especially in the aftermath of that protest. So we saw military police, riot police, just kind of parked in front of the venue as a kind of show of force to say, we don't want you trying anything again, in a sense. And that was also communicated by in a letter published by UNFCCC head Simon Steele, saying that you have the right to protest, but keep it in line, and we want to make sure this is a safe COP. So that set an interesting tone for sure. But yeah, there was also a people's march that took place kind of midweek through the COP that Mark was able to attend and report on. So I don't know if you want to speak to that, Mark, from that perspective. It was quite hot, I remember you telling me about that.
It was very hot, but also it was very it felt quite maybe not celebratory, but it felt very exuberant, I guess you could say, given that the previous 3 COPs hosted in the UAE, Azerbaijan, and Egypt, there wasn't a huge amount of civil society being able to freely protest. I think they had a people's march at the Egypt protest, at the Egypt COP, sorry, but it was like inside the venue, so it felt perhaps a little bit kind of constrained and quite sort of artificial, I guess you could say. Whereas this one that happened in the streets of Belem on the Saturday, I think there was something between 20 or 30,000 people of civil society that had all come together, and it was this like really big march with massive floats and music, and there was a lot of Indigenous representation there from all over the world, and it felt very much what you would think that a sort of a global conference on trying to stop climate change would feature, in the sense that there did seem to be like a real people's presence there that were making their voices heard about the leaders at the talks needing to do more to actually get the world in the direction that it needs to go in. And so it was really, quite moving in parts, just for myself personally, because this is the first COP that I've been to where such a march has been allowed to take place, and it happened on such a big scale that it was it was quite powerful.
Yeah, I can imagine, and I think that's one of the impacts of being a host country as well, is I guess greater community awareness of what COP is and what people are trying to achieve. Awesome. Well, for my final question, if I may, I'd like to fast forward a year, and of course you've just returned from COP31, and I'd love to hear your answers to the first question that we asked today, or what was the biggest achievement, or what is your wish list for COP31? What would you like to see focused on or happen, or outcomes?
I guess for myself, language around fossil fuels would be great, but after Belem, perhaps that's a bit too optimistic. But at the same time, I was just gonna pick up on the fossil fuel roadmap of transition, given that at this time next year we would have had in April we will have had the first dedicated conference on transitioning away on fossil fuels, which is being held in Colombia, and the Pacific has agreed to host a follow-up event on that, and that's part of that initiative that's being spearheaded by the Netherlands and Colombia that I spoke to earlier. So I think, yeah, in terms of how that all feeds into COP31, that we might see some genuine momentum there on that, especially given that it's by that point Brazil would have theoretically presented its gotten its roadmaps together on fossil fuel transition and deforestation. So perhaps one thing to hope for from an outcome from COP31 is, I guess, seeing that roadmap and then figuring out, okay, so how do you actually deploy that roadmap? How do you follow that roadmap to get to the transition away from fossil fuels that we actually need? That would be my biggest hope, I guess, for where things are heading.
Absolutely. And Allison, did you have a wish list as well?
Yeah, for COP31, I guess not too much more to add to Mark. I am curious to see how this joint governance will play out. So if there's anything on my wish list, I hope it goes smoothly.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for such an interesting discussion and reflection.
Thanks very much to both of you.
Yeah.
So that was wonderful. Thanks for those insights, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thanks, both.
Thanks so much, Murray. Thanks, Francesca.
Thanks very much, both. Good to talk.
Bye. That was a great chat with Allison and Mark, wasn't it,
It was
Francesca?
fantastic. Yeah, really good to hear what was going on over there. I mean, following on LinkedIn and from home, but it's good to get personal reflection from people in the know who do this all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, look, if you've enjoyed this episode, stay tuned for our next episode, which is a very exciting one for us, isn't it, Francisca?
Indeed.
Do you want to remind people what it's about?
Very exciting one indeed. We'll be unpacking the differences between real zero and net zero and what that means. And it's an open mic episode, which means we've got contributions from a range of different people, don't we?
We have indeed. And if you want to know about the 3 Ps, and if you want to know how Aldi's supermarket freezers are relevant to the discussion, well, you'll just have to tune in. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks. Bye-bye.